About Ezekiel. You know, a little sidebar, there's a great book written about Ezekiel. It's not really written about Ezekiel, but it's written. An engineer over in NASA who has designed everything from the first Apollo flights through the space shuttle and the moon landings and all that stuff. He was one of the guys that actually designed the equipment that landed on the moon and that stuff. He was an engineer. Structural engineer, and he was going to retire, and his wife, a very Christian woman, got him into the church and all that, and his pastor was preaching on Ezekiel and challenged the congregation to go home and read it. So he did that, and the more he read it, the more he was intrigued by it, and he wrote a book actually called, and I'm not lifting this book up by any means as truth, but he wrote a book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel. Because when God shows up in Ezekiel in these first couple of chapters, he said it sounded a lot like what he builds to take us to the moon and back. The whole thing, the landing, the whole thing. So he wrote a whole book and designed a spacecraft based on what's written in the book of Ezekiel. And to this day he says what Ezekiel was seeing was a spacecraft, not the Lord, that came from another planet or something. And it's an interesting read, you know, from the mind of an engineer, not a Christian, not a theologian, not a historian, but an engineer is looking at it saying, I could build that. You know, and so it's an interesting book. It's called The Spaceships of Ezekiel. I can't remember his name, but he was over at NASA forever. And not truthful. I mean, it's just his speculation, but it's interesting.
More fiction than anything.
Well, it's interesting, you know, where he says, what it sounds like to me is Ezekiel is describing the descent or landing of a spacecraft, not the Lord. So, who knows? Okay, maybe God was in a spacecraft. Who knows? All right, what do you know about Ezekiel?
Prophet.
He was a prophet. One of the major prophets at that.
Yeah. He was from the priestly group.
Yes, he had ties to the education thing. I forget what I was going to say.
He was a priest.
Yes, he was. He was tied to the priestly training. He was taken to Babylon. He was one of them that was captured after the destruction of Jerusalem and taken to Babylon. And he was in Babylon. This is Jerusalem here. Babylon is way over here. Here's the Persian Gulf. And this is the Tigris and the Euphrates River, which kind of goes east. Babylon's kind of in this area here. The palace would have been down about here, and roughly couple of thousand miles all the way around. You could not traverse this way because of the desert. It was just, in those days, you couldn't travel it. Unless you were like a nomadic group with a bunch of camels and a lot of water, and you could do that, but most of them didn't. What we call the Fertile Crescent, most people traveled this way in that part of the world, and it was simply because it's a desert, for crying out loud, 2,000 miles of desert. So anyway, they went around that way, and the Euphrates River up here, you know, it started up here, and then it came all the way down, and it fertilized everything and made everything lush and wonderful. Over here, you had Mount Hermon, which same thing, came down into the Sea of Galilee, and then all the way down to the Dead Sea. So this area was well watered and well traveled. They had what they built eventually called the King's Highway, which ran basically this way all the way around and down to Egypt. So that's kind of the geography of the thing. Once Jerusalem was destroyed, they took Ezekiel along with the other captives back to Babylon. where they would be. It was during that period in Babylon, as he was growing up, that he heard and wondered about the people and about Jerusalem and everything they've known, their culture, their life for 2,000 years had been destroyed, and everything was removed, everything was wiped out. And Ezekiel asked a couple of questions of God. Basically, he said, "Is there no hope?" And he also asked why this happened. And then he asked, can we be restored again? Can we be restored? And that's the biggest question the book is trying to answer. Is there possibility for me, for us, a sinful people who've turned our back on God, to be restored to Him again? Or have we crossed that line to where we can't get back? And God shows up and says, let's talk, Zeke. So old Zeke and God starts talking, and the Lord literally answers every one of these questions. It's a long work. It's 35 chapters or something like that, 32 chapters. That's why we call him a major prophet as against a minor prophet. The only difference is the major prophets were more long-winded. So Ezekiel, Isaiah, they're all 60 chapters, 55 chapters, 35 chapters. 48 chapters. Where the minor prophets are like 4 chapters or 3 chapters. So that's the only difference between a major prophet and a minor prophet, is they're long-winded. Okay, so this is the setting. The year is roughly, well, when they went to captivity, it was about 587 BC. So it was during that time, maybe 540. Around there, we're finally, after living in Babylon for a while, gaining some perspective, gaining some positions. The Lord answered, and He was getting ready, of course, to bring them out of the 70 years, and they're going to go back around 528 or something like that. And eventually, I think in 515 they dedicate the walls of the new walls of Jerusalem after they rebuild it and all that. So anyway, that's where they are. They're slaves in Babylonia. And he's out in the desert one day praying to God, saying, what is this it? We're just going to rot here and die here in the desert in a foreign land with foreign people and a foreign language? And is Israel over forever? And God shows up. Got to watch that, because he does that occasionally. Habakkuk learned that lesson the hard way. So, all right, let's look at chapter 1. Now it came about in the 13th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, I was by the river Shebar amongst the exiles. And the heavens were opened, and I saw a vision of God. The river Shebar is a little tributary off this Euphrates right here, where the Jews were being kept. He was by the river Shebar. Where am I? And the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzai, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Shebar. And there the hand of the Lord came mightily upon him. And I looked, and behold, a great storm wind was coming from the north, and a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a bright light all around it, and in its midst something like glowing metal in the midst of a fire. And within it there were figures resembling 4 living beings, and this was their appearance. One had a human form, and each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. And their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof, and they gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on the 4 sides were human hands, as for the faces and the wings of the 4 of them. Their wings touched one another, and their faces did not turn away when they moved. Each went straight forward. And as for the form of their faces, each had the face of that of a man, and all four of the faces of a lion on the right, and the face of a bull on the left, and the face of the eagle. There were such were the faces, and their wings were spread out above, each had two touching and another being, and the two covering their bodies. And each went straight forward whenever the Spirit was about to go, and they would go without turning as they went. In the midst of the living beings there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches darting back and forth amongst the living beings. And the fire was bright, and the lightning was flashing from the fire. And the living beings ran to and fro like lightning bolts. And now I looked at the living beings, and behold, there was one wheel on the earth beside the living beings for each of the four of them. And their appearance of the wheels was, and the workmanship was like that of a sparkling beryl. Beryl was a metal, a gem in those days. And all four of them had the same form, their appearance and workmanship being as if one wheel were in another. Whenever they moved in any of the four directions without turning as they moved. As for the rims, they were lofty and awesome, and the rims of all four of them were full of eyes round about. And wherever the living beings moved, the wheels moved with them, and wherever the living beings rose from the earth, the wheels rose with them also. Wherever the Spirit was about to go, they would go in that direction, and the wheels rose close behind them. And the spirit of the living being was in the wheels. Wherever those went, these went, and whenever they stood still, these stood still. And whenever those rose from the earth, the wheels rose close behind them, for the spirit of the living beings was in the wheels. Now, over the heads of the living beings, there was something like an expanse, like an awesome gleam of a crystal extended over their heads. And under their expanse of their wings were stretched out straight, one toward the other. Each one also had two wings covering their bodies on the one side and on the other. And as they went, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of an abundant waters as they went, like the voice of the Almighty, the sound of a tumult, like the sound of an army camp. Whenever they stood still, they dropped their wings. And there came a voice from the expanse that was over their heads wherever they stood still, and they dropped their wings. Now above the expanse that was over their heads, there was something resembling a throne that like lapis and lua in appearance. And on that which assembled those high up was a figure of the appearance of a man. And I noticed from the appearance of his loins and upward something like glowing metal, light glowing metal that looked like fire, and all around it within it. And from the appearance of his loins and downward I saw something like fire, and there was a radiance surrounding him. And the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day was also, so was the appearance of those surrounding radiance. And such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. And when I saw it, I fell on my face and heard a voice speaking to me. What do you think? The appearance of God or a spaceship?
It's God showed up in majesty.
It's very detailed.
It is very detailed for a guy sitting out there going, what the hell is that? I'd have been running. Hide me behind a rock or something. Big old thing coming down. It is very detailed. Pretty incredible story if you think about it. And that's why a lot of people refuse to believe it. And the other crazy people believe, well, it was a visit from an alien race. It was not the Lord, it was a spaceship. And more people will believe that than will believe it was the Lord, which is sad. Now, there is one thing about this that redeems it, and who can tell me what that is?
Well, he says it's the glory of the Lord.
It's the four living beings. What does these three things tell you? Four living beings, the presence of a throne in their midst, and surrounded by the glory of God, or a rainbow on a rainy day. What does that tell you?
He was taken into heaven to see heaven, but he wouldn't keep.
I don't know if he was taken into heaven, but maybe heaven was coming. Yeah, he was coming down.
Okay.
The reason I say this could be of God is because when John is taken in the Spirit to heaven in the Revelation, this is the first thing he sees upon entering heaven, is a throne surrounded by four living beings and framed by the rainbow, the promise of redemption, not destruction. Got to remember, I know today in this day and age, rainbows mean homosexuals, and that's sad. They have taken that image to themselves and have, used it in every way possible. But in the Bible, remember, the first rainbow occurred after Noah. And God said, I will make a pledge with you that I will never again destroy this earth like this. And he set in his heavens his bow as a promise. And that was the first rainbow in the Bible. And it was after they'd come out of the ship, after they'd come out to a new world, and it was a redeeming. E-M-I-N-G. It was a redeeming sign. It was a sign of redemption. It was a sign that God has not given up on us, that it is still possible, even though the whole world was evil. Noah and his family came out to a new world and was under God's care once again. So the first thing Ezekiel sees, remember the questions he's asking. In light of these questions, and you'll see these questions literally asked in later chapters, but I'm kind of jumping ahead of myself. This was on his mind. He had been down here in this time for 13 years or whatever it said. A long time out in the middle of the desert, over here off the little tributary Shebar, seeing his people suffer under captivity of the Babylonians, and he finally said, is Jerusalem, is Israel done? Will we ever be a people again? Have we committed the unanswerable sin, the unforgivable sin? Have we gone too far? And God shows up to begin answering those questions. And it's interesting that when he does show up, what are the first three things he sees? The same redemptive promise. Back to Noah, they would have known about this. What do we see? Well, with the same redemptive promise all the way down here when John enters heaven in the Revelation. First three things he sees are these. The promise of redemption surrounded by the rainbow, the authority of God upon the throne, and the four living beings. Now the four living beings, let's talk about these for a minute. It's better said in the Revelation, but here we see a reference to them. And they represent the four stages, literally, living beings, the four stages of mankind. Mankind is a sinful, fallen man. Sinful, fallen man. You know, all the scriptures that talk about all flesh has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All flesh stands in the need of my grace. All flesh, no one is righteous, not one. Throughout the scriptures you see this over and over again. The second living being is that of the redemption or new birth The third living being represents a growing or a maturing. The need to grow up. You know, you guys were both born babies, right? Little tiny creatures, wiggly things. And now you're young men, strong, and getting ready to face life on your own for the first time, which is great. But what if you were still a little baby, acting like a little baby, talking like a little baby, demanding like a little baby? Would your mom put up with that? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. The cucarachas, they throw them in the sea. That's what happens. You gotta grow up. Your mother expected you to grow up. She still expects you to grow up, right? Are they going to be living in your house and when they're 35, 45, 55? Trust me, I've had them in my house. I just booted one out a couple of months ago. The point is, you're expected to grow. You're expected to mature. You can't stay a baby. The baby years were great. Mom loved it. You loved it. Everybody loved it. But now you've got to take your responsibility unto yourself. You've got to grow up. You've got to mature. You've got to become, I hate to be cliche here, but you've got to become all that God intends for you to be. I know the Army uses that, be all that you can be, a soldier. But basically God's saying the same thing. You cannot stay a child. Paul says it in the New Testament. He says, by now you should be teachers of the Word. And here you are needing the fundamental, the milk of the Word over again, like a little baby. You should be teachers of the Word by now. What are you not doing here? So that's the third being, is a maturing. From a sinful state to a redemptive state to a maturing state. And then finally, the eagle, to a glorified state where you are soaring and reigning with God all the days of your life. This is the promise of Revelation. The same four beings that John saw when he walked into heaven in the Revelation is pretty much the same thing that Ezekiel's seeing. The only difference is Ezekiel is 587 years before, 5 centuries before. But later, after Jesus departs and the Christian church is started, maybe around 96 AD, 95 AD, Jesus has been gone, 40, 50 years. And John's an old man. They throw him out on the island to die. And he's crying out and he's saying, God, is this all there is? Was it true? All that Jesus told us. Was it true? It's in that despairing, God shows up again. And he says, John, come with me. I got something to show you. And he walks into heaven, and the first thing he sees is the same thing. Now, was this a spaceship? Well, you got a case for it, I guess. God can be pretty impressive when he wants to be. I mean, think about it. The whole Egyptian thing with the 10 plagues and the fire from heaven and the wind and all that stuff. Could he be impressive with Ezekiel? Yes. The only reason I'm going to say it was God and not a spaceship is because God continues to identify himself in this fashion from the very beginning, earliest of scriptures, to the late Old Testament, to the early New Testament, and then to the end of the world. And when you keep seeing the same thing repeated over and over and over again, there's a reason for it, and God wants you to know, I am. Kind of like the old cartoon. God, if you're up there, give me a sign. And the next thing you know, the guy's standing here and a huge sign drops, just misses him. And the sign says, I'm up here. Just so you know. So this is how it's starting. You got to remember, Ezekiel's a prisoner. He's a captive. He's over here in a strange land, a strange country, strange language, strange culture, strange everything. All that he has known for 2,000 years as a priest, the high rituals, the high holy days, the great and glorious worship services is gone. All that's been erased. So literally Ezekiel has been erased. And he stands out on the desert and he begins to despair and he's going, God, are we here forever? Is this it? Or can we expect something different? And just like John, out on the island of Patmos by himself, dying, an old man falls into the sand and says, God, All that stuff that Jesus taught us, was it true? Or was it just nice rhetoric? 50 years have passed. All the other apostles are dead. All the friends of the apostles are dead. All the families and farms and everything of the apostles were taken by the Romans. He was the last one, and in his despair on a lonely island, on the beach, in the sand, and a very old, broken old man asked God a question, was it true? And God shows up and says, John, come with me. I got something I want to show you. The Lord shows him it doesn't have to be the end. Sinful man can be redeemed, can mature in the Lord, and someday will reign with me forever and ever. That's how the Revelation ends, if you remember that. And reign with me forever and ever. That same. And that's what the four living beings represent. Everybody always asks me, what's that all about? The four stages of our lives. Some choose to stay as a fallen sinful man. Despite God's effort to redeem them, they don't want it. And you have that right. You can walk away. Others are redeemed but never go any further than that. So they kind of tend to eventually fall away. Because Jesus says you can't stand on the fence. You're either for me or you're against me. There's no both and. It's either or in God's case. Some take the time, like you sit here in this Bible study class, to learn about this word, to take time to make it a priority. And in this, hopefully, in my teaching and your worship and everything else, your devotions, you will mature and become more grown up in God. Just as you grow up as a man, grow up as a spiritual man, grow up as a spiritual woman. And then eventually, as God promised, He will glorify you. The world won't. And you shouldn't try and glorify yourself. He will glorify you, and you will reign with Him forever and ever. And that's His promise to us, not our promise to Him. This is all about what He's doing for us, not us doing for Him. Okay? This is chapter 1, and it opens the door that, Ezekiel's standing here in a wasteland, in a desertous region, a very hostile wilderness, asking God, are we done? The Lord shows up and says, Ezekiel, let me show you something. And all the promises of eternity literally are spread before him. And God's going to ask him a question. You interested? We'll get to that next week. This chapter is basically God showing up, just as He would. He said, I'd never leave you, I'd never forsake you, the whole 9 yards. In the midst of despair, be careful what you ask for. Say, God, where are you? Sometimes He'll tell you where He is. Okay, that's chapter 1. Short lesson today.